Reconstruction of Japan after World War II is a weird corner of US history which doesn't seem to get talked about very much. I guess it just falls right through the crack between World War II and the Cold War. My empirical evidence for this claim is that back in the early 2000s, I used to watch a lot of History Channel. And forget about being highlighted, I don't recall the US occupation of Japan ever being mentioned anywhere on any program. Somehow, despite school, college, and the History Channel, I didn't even become aware that it was a thing until years later when I watched an Akira Kurosawa movie called Drunken Angel. It's about a gangster who forms a rocky relationship with a doctor who's simultaneously trying to get him treated for his tuberculosis and pull him out of his illicit, hard-living lifestyle. But it's set against the backdrop of post-war Japan, and there's a distinctly Western influence seeping into the Japanese culture within the story, which, if you're familiar with Kurosawa, is a theme that encapsulates his style pretty well. But this isn't a film discussion. Anyway, when I watched the bonus materials on the Drunken Angel DVD, which I checked out from my local library, I was taken aback when it elaborated on the movie's theme of US occupation, and I was like, I guess it makes sense that this happened, but why don't I know about it? So let's know about it together. America's story in Japan always seems to end with 2 nuclear explosions and a formal surrender by the country, which I always assumed was followed shortly by an awkward silence as America looked at its watch and said, well, good luck with those radioactive craters, I have to go fight communism now. But no, the US actually stuck around Japan for several more years, with the intent of making sure Japan could never again mount a threat to the peace of the planet as it did in World War II. Although Reconstruction was technically a joint effort by the Allied forces, the United States was pretty much the only country involved. Famous cartoon caricature of a general, Douglas MacArthur, actually spearheaded the project as Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, or SCAP for short. As the name suggests, the title grants incredible latitude to the holder. MacArthur was basically America's viceroy unto Japan. The first order of business for the US was to dismantle the Japanese military forever. Sounds kind of nuts, especially when your present-day next-door neighbor keeps test-firing missiles through your airspace, but that's what happened. Japanese military officials were barred from holding office in government, and in Tokyo, the US carried out war crime trials where a handful of high-ranking officials were tried, convicted, and even executed. Make no mistake, the things invading Japanese forces did to civilians and POWs alike across East Asia during their World War II expansionist campaign can only be described as barbaric and nightmarish. That being said, the United States just purposefully wiped out well over 100,000 Japanese civilians in what remains the world's only nuclear attack. And now Uncle Sam's going to ride in on his high horse and shake his finger at Japanese war crimes? Okay, I guess somebody had to do it, and no one else showed up. Tens of thousands of Japan nationalist employees were purged from positions in every level of government. And by every level, I mean anyone collecting a government paycheck, so workers like teachers and police officers were included on that list. The rest of the Reconstruction process can best be described as America trying its best to rebuild Japan from the ground up in its own image. The US forged a democratic constitution for the country, replacing the Meiji Constitution, which, among other things, stripped away the ruling emperor's political powers and gave Japanese citizens the ability to choose their government officials by voting. On the economic front, the US sowed the seeds of free market capitalism by, get this, breaking up big businesses and reducing the power of rich landowners. Doesn't sound like any America I'm familiar with. Japan entered an economic downturn early on in the occupation, and it was doubly important to the US to get the country on its feet quickly under a capitalist model because the Cold War was just beginning and communism could easily take root in any country with a charismatic agitator and enough disgruntled citizens. especially in East Asia. The Cold War, put simply, was a sort of control point match where two superpowers with opposing ideologies were trying to convert other nations to their values in hopes of inoculating them against the allure of the other, thereby containing the spread of their enemy's power. So, exactly like Splatoon. America's efforts to stabilize Japan got a shot in the arm as the US entered the Korean War in 1950, and Japan became a hub for military resupply and base of operations. Once it looked like Japan could take it from here, the US was relatively quick out the door 2 years later after working out a security pact and peace treaty in San Francisco. Although the occupation was over, America got to keep its Japanese military bases. And after kicking off the Cold War right in Japan's backyard, it seemed reasonable now for the US to allow them to at least have a defense force to protect themselves. And they got that in 1954. That's more or less the setup we have today, with both countries enjoying a two-way security agreement. It's easy to view this Reconstruction foray as possessing many of the hallmarks of the Manifest Destiny ideology or even American imperialism. And there is some of that, but this transformation was largely a mutual endeavor, a continuation of Japan's interest in westernization which began decades earlier at the dawn of the Meiji era. Japan was voluntarily receptive to many of the systems touted by the United States, but at the same time retained much of its unique culture. In the end, though, there's no disputing the significance of post-war Reconstruction in forming the Japan we see today. But not the weird stuff. Okay, some of the weird stuff.